A week of frigid weather in February 2021 caused a massive breakdown of infrastructure in Texas. It was not just the burden of the storm, but neglect and climate change denial that led up to it. Yet the failures have not been felt equally. There were reports of power being cut in low-income neighborhoods and communities of color before wealthy neighborhoods. Tent camps of asylum seekers along the border had to endure freezing weather while being detained in the Rio Grande Valley, which has some of the highest COVID infection rates in the country. Kids were admitted to the hospital for carbon monoxide poisoning as families burned what they could to keep warm. And those that were lucky enough to keep their power are facing astronomical electric bills, running into 4 digits. Some 13.5 million people throughout Texas experienced water disruptions, with nearly 800 water systems reporting issues like frozen or broken pipes. About 725 systems were under a boil water advisory. There were many Texans who could not flush their toilets. Across the United States, failing water and wastewater infrastructure like what we saw in Texas is the canary in the coal mine. It is where climate change meets environmental justice. It is where rapidly falling and rising temperatures meet decades of faulty infrastructure, and the consequences for health and wealth can be catastrophic. Let me back up a few years. I grew up and around the rural community of Lowndes County, Alabama. Located between Selma and Montgomery, Bloody Lowndes was the epicenter of the civil rights movement, and my childhood was in education and activism. My parents had leaders of the movement in and out of our home, and I learned at a young age that we all have power to create change. After a few years living in other states, I felt the call home to Alabama in the early 2000s. When I returned, armed with the perspective of living in more urban environments, I was shocked to see how many of my family members, friends, and neighbors were still dealing with major infrastructure failures. As my parents did before me, I knew I had to help. And 20 years later, I'm an environmental and climate justice activist. I serve as the Rural Development Manager for the Equal Justice Initiative, and I am also a board member for the NRDC and the Climate Reality Project. Last fall, I was awarded a MacArthur grant and published my first book, Waste. And just last week, I was named to the first ever White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. At the center of this work is my role as the director and founder of the Center for Rural Enterprise and Environmental Justice. I lead our organization in its aim to reduce economic and health disparities and to improve access to clean water, air, and soil in marginalized rural communities. We do this by influencing policy, inspiring wastewater innovation, and amplifying the voices of community leaders, all within the context of a changing climate. I define failing wastewater infrastructure in 3 ways. 1, no sewage system in a home. 2, failing personal septic systems. Or 3, failing municipal systems. When people have no sewage system, they often straight pipe the waste out of a home. When they flush their toilets, it ends up on the ground, goes into a pit or into a ditch. In the United States, we still do not know how many people are using straight pipes. This can be catastrophic for your health, especially as the changing climate is making tropical diseases associated with raw sewage more prevalent. At least 20% of the United States is on septic systems, and many are failing. If recent climate-related events, like the disaster in Texas, are an indicator, that number could be astronomical. Wastewater treatment plants are also failing. It is a fight to ensure basic human dignity through a right most Americans take for granted: sanitation. Too many people, especially the rural poor, lack an affordable means of disposing cleanly of the waste from their toilets, and therefore they live amid conditions that many urban dwellers cannot imagine. This is America's dirty little secret. Our problem begins with a basic lack of information. The U.S. Census Bureau stopped collecting county-level data on septic systems in 1990 because no federal program regulates septic systems. National data is gathered every 2 years through the American Housing Survey, which uses a much smaller sample size. A few states like Georgia have initiated septic mapping systems to pinpoint areas of concern. Without knowing how many septic systems exist, we have very little reliable data on how many septic systems are failing. The numbers could be huge. The Ohio Department of Health, for an example, estimates that 31% of septic systems in the state are not working properly. Nearly one-third of all systems are failing, and yet we suspect this number to be much higher. Imagine if one-third of highways, or bridges, or power lines, or any other form of essential infrastructure were failing. Failing or non-existent wastewater infrastructure is a problem in all 50 states, and those results can be catastrophic. Pathogens can end up in drinking water, lakes, rivers, and the Gulf of Mexico. Florida, for instance, has a multi-billion-dollar septic tank problem. 2.7 million septic tanks are responsible for between 15% to 30% of the nitrogen and phosphorus that seeps into springs. My hope is that where curiosity and understanding start, action and progress will follow. Let us look at the basic toilet. I know everyone hates talking about it, but it is something that we all use. Now imagine a toilet attached to a system that can document viruses and diseases before they take root in a community. We know that COVID exists in wastewater. What if a toilet had informed us of its existence much earlier? What if we could warn a community that a surge is coming based on the hard evidence in their wastewater? The next phase of my work will be dedicated to technological solutions like the next generation toilet and sewage system. I plan to work in Huntsville, Alabama, a city known for its contributions to science, technology, and U.S. space exploration. Our quest for equitable and sustainable wastewater infrastructure will start and end with the guiding principle of environmental justice and community input, directly from those living with failing wastewater infrastructure, from places like Lowndes County to the Colonias, Centerville, Illinois, to Appalachia, to Hawaii, to indigenous lands. This would shift the top-down approach of the current engineering paradigm. Let me say that again. This would shift the top-down approach of the current engineering paradigm. We want everyone to know that environmental justice starts with all of us thinking about what we can do. First, look at your own states and communities and see if wastewater problems exist. It is not necessarily only in rural areas. It could be in the suburbs or anywhere people use on-site systems or wastewater treatment plants. Write your elected officials responsible for funding wastewater treatment and make sure that funding language incorporates rural communities. If policies are written to only include towns, it excludes the unincorporated areas. When state governments get the money, let's make sure they are accountable to environmental justice communities and not just to the elite that can hire lobbyists to represent their interests. Second, let us, the Center for Rural Enterprise and Environmental Justice, know if the issue exists in your area. The government has not done a good job of collecting this information, so we must do it. It can be helpful for us to be able to know where, outside of the Southeast, that this is a problem, so that officials can no longer refuse to acknowledge it. We can innovate our way out of this climate and environmental justice disaster. This is possible. And never has there been so much incentive to develop technologies like this and put it into practice. We already have a technology that converts our astronauts' wastewater into drinking water. If we can do that in space, imagine what we can and should do for the rest of humankind and Mother Earth. With research and ingenuity, we can flip the script on sanitation equity. Most people in America have the privilege to flush and forget, but my experience has taught me that we can flush and learn.